My name is Amy Charlan, and I'm co-director at McCann. We're a Palestinian-led educational organisation based in Britain, and we're delighted to be joined today by Susan Abalawa, Palestinian-American writer and activist, Aileen Batarse, Executive Director of Visualizing Palestine, a data-led communication resource, and Ala Tartir, who's Programme and Policy Advisor at the Palestinian policy think tank Shabaka. We're just very excited to be joined by Susan Abalawa, who's going to kick off our discussion with some opening remarks.
Thank you, Amy. Narrative and stories, as I have often said, are fundamental elements of identity, both as individuals and as collectives. We're made of stories. And as a colonial project, Zionism understood this well. And from the very outset, they worked hard to control how their conquest was told to the world, and in particular to masses in Western countries where power is concentrated. And at the same time, Palestinian resistance has been stubborn, unseating their lies and their myths at every turn. So, of course, the first fairy tale was that European Jews who survived genocide perpetrated by their non-Jewish countrymen and women in Europe found a, quote, land without a people for a people without a land. This first story erased Palestinian existence entirely, which is what Zionists aim to do all along, and they're still trying to do. And this narrative stuck for a while, primarily because Zionists, as Europeans themselves, had cultural and linguistic access to Western cultures that indigenous Palestinians did not necessarily have. And it was, more importantly, it was also the happy ending that Europe wanted to believe. And so that's the story that persisted for a long time. And Hollywood tried its best to reinforce this myth with propaganda films like Exodus, starring Paul Newman, for example. But again, Palestinians are stubborn people. And of course, we refuse to recede into this romantic fall of Zion conquest. But that still didn't stop Zionists from insisting that we don't exist. Of course, there's Golda Meir's famous declaration that, quote, Palestinians don't exist. And ironically, she made this statement from a house that she had stolen from Palestinian owners, specifically Hanna Brahim Chara. That, she took the home, it was complete with furniture, artwork, books, kitchenware, and even clothes. And it was only when Palestinians began armed resistance against Israel, ironically, as well as plane hijackings, that the world could no longer ignore us and pretend that we did not exist. And thus that original myth was completely unseated. If you look at old clippings and footage of media in the West, you'll see that reporters usually and correctly referred to individuals involved in hijackings as guerrilla fighters or resistance fighters. But Israeli propaganda kicked into gear, and again, with the help of Hollywood, created a new narrative about Palestinians that revolved around the word terrorist or terrorism. And again, ironically, that's the word terrorist is what the British originally labeled Zionist gangs and militia in Mandate Palestine, as they actually were the first people to load bombs onto trucks and drive them into crowded markets, lynch people, blow up buses, hotels, and other buildings full of people. That's a history of Zionism that's conveniently ignored generally. But once again, the malicious colonial narrative of Israel fell apart when the media could no longer ignore the images of Palestinian children confronting armed soldiers and tanks, nothing but their bodies and rocks during Intifada. This was a very crucial moment for us. Israel at this time failed miserably to control narrative, and they were at last being exposed for the brutal colonizers that they are. And it is precisely this inability to maintain their moral fairy tale that they enter into these so-called peace talks. This was the only impetus to do this for Israel to enter into so-called negotiations, was to put an end to the first Intifada, which was succeeding, albeit at a great cost to Palestinians, in changing truly the narrative. Now, in the past few decades, generations of Palestinians that grew up in the West, who have cultural and linguistic access to the societies in which they grew up in the West, have done the hard and sustained work of exposing the truth, which has shifted the narrative in such a way that despite enormously funded propaganda campaigns and clearly biased media in the US, Palestinians, I believe, have won the moral argument. Shape-shifting, as usual, Israel's news story now is that they are the actual natives waging a struggle against Arab interlopers and anti-Semites. This is a truly extraordinary claim, and it also leans on this idea of divine destiny, which is almost exactly the same as the so-called manifest destiny claim of white settlers in the Americas several centuries ago. So lastly, while the truth of Israeli settler colonialism is being revealed in the West, the narrative is shifting, I think, in the opposite direction in parts of the global South, in countries that originally and historically instinctively sided with Palestine, as they themselves were colonized and understood well what colonialism was and what it meant. But while Palestinians have focused on narratives in the West, Israel has been really inserting itself in local politics throughout the global South, through bribes and various charitable charitable endeavors and other exploitive means. So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to open it up to the panelists to kind of give me your reactions and your just opening kind of reflections on your sense of this shifting narrative and where we are now and what this means. So we'll start with Amy. Do you want to kick us off?
I mean, I think I'll talk a little bit just around the shifting narrative here in Britain. First off, I mean, I grew up here as a British Palestinian in the 1970s, and it was a period in which casual British racism was prevalent. So in the classroom, terms like dirty little Arab were kind of ones that would just kind of go around quite easily in a way that isn't the case today, although I think probably there are still sort of shadows of that, obviously, underlying a lot of educational settings, unfortunately. But it was also at that time, as you were sort of mentioning, Susan, a time when to say Palestinian was synonymous to say terrorist. And there was a sort of double humiliation in terms of being excessively exposed to sort of public condemnation and at the same time being held at a different level of humanity. I think so Edward Said was really kind of apposite when he said that we must understand the struggle between the Palestinians and Zionism as a struggle between a presence and an interpretation, the former constantly appearing to be overpowered and eradicated by the latter. Certainly, we've had a long history in terms of the subsumption of Palestinian history by the West within social and historical and religious developments of Israel. And that's really been coupled with a kind of political and educational amnesia around Britain's role in Palestine and in the dispossession of Palestinians as well. And I think, mention to any Palestinian that you come from Britain, and the name Balfour will come up very, very quickly. Whereas most people here in the UK have no clue who Balfour was or anything really about Britain's role in the dispossession of Palestinians. And it certainly wasn't something that was covered in our learnings at school when I was younger. And yet the narratives have been shifting here, and that's happened over a sort of a series of events around Palestine, with people seeing the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, the first Intifada, and then Oslo, which sort of really changed the narrative in a regressive way, I would say, in terms of the notion of liberation being reduced to a peace-building narrative, and also kind of terms around the two equal sides and a zero-sum game, and a complex situation that nobody can understand, with an overriding sort of notion of security for Israel. But then again, we've kind of had the war in Lebanon in 2006, the assaults on Gaza, the Great March of Return, the Unity Intifada, and that's sort of led to a resituating of Palestine as, I think, particularly among the younger generation, as an anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle that intersects with other social justice movements. And I think really there's been a huge body of writing, obviously, on Palestine, but the use of the term Palestine or Palestinian hasn't guaranteed at all that a Palestinian history or narrative is being given a voice. So now I think the move it's changed in terms of the demand that you have to have Palestinian voices at the center, sort of nothing about us without us, as the saying goes. And it's also essential that those who want to speak out in solidarity with Palestinians are equipped with the knowledge and tools and confidence to talk about Palestine, and to help kind of move the narrative and shift those narratives back to kind of the root causes that you were touching on earlier, Susan.
Thank you, and especially the centering Palestinian voices. I think that's really important. And I want to, you mentioned something that I kind of want to circle back to later, just to give everyone else a heads up on the intersectionality of narratives shifting. So Aileen, why don't we go to you and for some reflections, and then Ala.
Thank you so much, Susan, and it's really exciting to be in conversation with Amy, Ala, and yourself, Susan. It's really an honor to be talking to you today. Thank you for joining us in this important talk. I guess I would start with, acknowledging that there is no just one narrative on Palestine. And narratives change depending on context, culture, exposure, experiences. In the US in particular, the narrative on Palestine has largely throughout the years been informed by non-Palestinians. Right now, this is where I am based, but I am, all my life I lived in Palestine, specifically in Jerusalem. But when I first came to the US about 20 years ago as an undergraduate student, I remember so clearly the stark difference between the reality that I was exposed to as a Palestinian that was living under Israeli colonization, and the reporting that I was exposed to on Israel and Palestine. And I remember distinctly feeling that this is an alternative imagined reality. This is not reflecting what I'm experiencing. And it's also, it made me feel like the roles of oppressors was reversed, that Palestinians were somehow the oppressors. And this is very clear in the way media reports on Palestine. I have also seen this change over the years, but it's mainly not thanks to mainstream media. It's because of the emergence of alternative media outlets that center Palestinian voices. And it's thanks to us as Palestinians for not giving up and for refusing to have our narratives hijacked. I think, obviously we still have a long way to go because those alternative spaces are not available unless people seek them out, unfortunately, and while we try to get more and more into the mainstream, there are challenges there. And I have to say that, of course, we also have to thank, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, a lot of other groups that also suffer from being marginalized by those that are in dominance, that are refusing to not be at the table. And of course, in recent years, the rise of social media and Palestinians claiming space on social media has been very important. We've been using social media to post videos and photos of violence that we're experiencing at the hands of Israeli settlers and soldiers. And that has been a very important space for Palestinians. And I think, culminating in what we saw during the Unity Intifada and the wide support that we got from around the world around what was happening in Palestine and in opposition to what was happening. I do want to mention, because I am currently in the US, also just experiencing what has happened with the Black Lives Matter movement over the years, and forcing American individuals and institutions to reckon with racism and making those direct links with Palestine and anti-Palestinian racism that exists in the US, but that also is the basis of Israel's existence. And just to say that, before I joined VP, I've been with VP for the past year. And before that, I worked with a women's rights organization, and it was largely a white feminist organization based in DC. And over a period of 4 years, I witnessed a shift within the organization on how Palestine is talked about. And it's not because there was no support for Palestine or no understanding of the context, but even the understanding of Palestine as a feminist issue, Palestine as a social justice issue, was an evolution over the 4 years that I was at the organization. And it's largely because the Black Lives Matter movement was making those linkages that people could no longer ignore. And where, we saw parallels being drawn by the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government, and progressives and people that are more on the left, thinking that they do not want to be affiliated with Israel as an ethno-nationalist, white supremacist state. And it is less and less a country that people want to be affiliated with, especially progressives. Of course, I'm not talking about Republicans here. So yeah, these are some reflections. I know we will get into a bit more of this later in the discussion. So I'll stop here and over to you, Ala.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all these valuable reflections. And thanks, Susan, for your opening remarks. Your opening remarks brought to my mind 5 different issues, at least. But one of them is really the importance of linking the narrative with identity. And that's really fundamental, not to underestimate. And it is really important to remember that preserving narrative, shaping that narrative, and correcting that narrative, they are all acts of resistance. And we should not underestimate the value and the importance of such an act of resistance where we preserve, where we shape, where we correct narrative. So thanks so much for bringing that element to this discussion. And the second point relates to the notion of power imbalances and the relationship between that and the narrative. What we need to induce any kind of change is really to shake the current power imbalance. And narrative is one of these tools that allow us to shake that, because we do need to shake that in order to create a change. And also the third point relates to the question of labeling here. Who labels who, in what label, and what are the consequences of that process of labeling? So we need to question and problematize this issue of labeling, because it is really important as it shapes policies afterwards. And the final 2 points relate to to the act of preserving narrative and correcting it and shaping it, it is an active process. It's not a passive process. It's a process where you act, not only react. It's a process that implies that you plan, not only react. It's a process that really bring a new way of thinking to this liberation process, where we need to think about it as an active process, yes, of resistance, but also of planning. Any liberation project needs the fundamental way of planning it, and that is a tool. And finally, the importance of narrative and narrative shifts is that they can be an avenue for accountability. And that's really important to keep in mind. Accountability is sorely missed in all these circles that we're talking about. And we need to bring accountability to the center and the core of our operations. And narrative shifts allow us to amplify this issue of how do we change the power imbalances there by investing more in the avenues of accountability. So I just wanted to put these 5 elements for discussion and further reflections.
Thank you, Ala. You actually just brought up a lot of stuff in my mind as well. I'm interested, I want to stick with you for a little bit. If you can expand a little bit on this active process. I mean, if you can give us a little bit of kind of the mechanics, what are the elements of a shifting narrative? So, and I want to stress that we are talking about narratives in the West, specifically here in the United States and in Europe. But there's also, and I touched on this earlier, narratives in the global South. But one thing that you just made me think of too is that also narratives internally, like how much we have internalized a narrative that was imposed on us. And that's something I think that's really important. And I'd like everybody to comment on that. But I'm going to start with you, Ala, if you can just kind of, that was a lot of questions in one, but, I'm sure you can manage it.
No, thanks so much for this. For me, as someone who, as I always say, lived his first quarter of a century of his life under the brutality of the Israeli occupation, studied, worked, lived there, I always struggled with this idea: why we're always reactive, why we don't take the lead. And yes, of course, this is a larger problem related to the leadership question, but that's why something that always puzzled me and continues to puzzle me: what are the prerequisites that we need in order to lead the process, in order to active? And I don't want to do marketing for the 3 organizations, but the 3 organizations are precisely doing this. We plan, we are proactive, we shape policies, we shape narratives. We try to change the old mode of operations, if you want, like the way where we're just reactive, we're passive. We're passive recipients, but also we're passive actors. And this is what we really need to change. Of course, all of this requires a leadership, and here I'm talking about the broad leadership in the broader sense, where we internally believe that we need to be active internally, and I mean here all the Palestinians, including the leadership, political parties, but also civil society actors, think tanks, institutions. We all need to move to be active in not only in shaping our narratives and reclaiming our narrative, but operationalizing that narrative, in the sense that, yes, we have a narrative and we shape this narrative, but that's not enough if we don't have concrete, clear steps. And this is where the proactive measures come in. This is where the move from reactive to active as a process of resistance. And this is fundamental. It is a process of resistance because this is what we need. And therefore, this is where we can move to that process. I have a lot more to say, but I want to move also to my colleagues to contribute to this.
So Aylan, thank you, Ala. I want to move to you for a little bit and just kind of to piggyback off of some of the things that Ala was saying. I mean, I'm a novelist, so I often think of culture in terms of, you know, in terms of narrative, in terms of, you know, defining narrative. In fact, even in societies who aren't oppressed, culture is what defines the narrative of different societies, right? So, can you speak to that? And in particular, since you are visualizing Palestine, it's some of the really brilliant work that you guys do in condensing enormous amounts of information and data to you know, easily digestible, understood, and aesthetically pleasing visuals. So if you can speak to that, and also kind of and I want to stick with also to say something about our internalized narratives about that are detrimental to us as well. I think you're mute.
Yes, sorry, it's taking me a second to find the bottom, but you know, I think I'm really glad you brought up this internalized, you know, narrative. We often hear this term, internalized racism. We hear, you know, the colonization of the mind. You know, we've heard about the occupation of the American mind, but really, a lot of the struggle, I think, for us as a colonized people is to challenge this internal colonization, which, you know, Israel wants us to believe we're inferior. It wants us to believe that, you know, we're not worthy of freedom, you know, and we see this in the propaganda. Obviously, that's displayed as well. And Suzanne, I'm also, you know, I want to refer to your book Against the Loveless World, because it's the inspiration for the title of this conversation. And obviously, you know, it's a quote based on James Baldwin's 1963 book, The Fire Next Time, and, you know, calling for the destruction of racism in the US and for Black political love against the loveless world. And I was also, you know, I was reading a little bit about his work, and this quote really stood out to me, which, you know, reflects, which is a good reflection on what it means to internalize this kind of narrative that is self-destructive. And he says, the details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. And I think, you know, this is just so important to remember, because it's very relevant to the Palestinian context and to how Israel uses its fear and its insecurity. You know, we've seen over the past few weeks alone, and with the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, how Israel was arresting people for carrying the Palestinian flag. I mean, this, you know, for also making children take off their T-shirts because they have a rifle on them. The level of inhumanity and fear that they have resorted to is really mind-boggling, and is a reflection of this instability that they're actually feeling with their existence. So and moving to art and culture here, you know, one thing I'd say is that obviously art and culture reflect experiences and lived realities of individuals and communities. And in the Palestinian context specifically, our art and culture is very much political, because our reality and daily experiences are colored by colonialism. And just as in other contexts, we see dominant social groups that want to depoliticize, you know, sports, music, food. You know, we see it with the appropriation of our food and our culture. All of a sudden, hummus and falafel are Israeli. All of a sudden, you know, the kafiyeh is used. You know, so there's so much appropriation, and because it is inconvenient for them to talk, you know, to think about oppression while being entertained. For us, it is the reality. that we live, that we're experiencing. Moving to visualizing Palestine, for those of you that don't know, visualizing Palestine combines data and storytelling to reflect the lived reality of Palestinians. Our aim is to advance a rights-based narrative of Palestine and Palestinians, and each visual has a different story to tell. And there's always more we want to say with our visuals because there is so much to cover. And which is why we create a lot of different visuals on different topics. We have about 200 infographics. A lot of them focus on apartheid, but we also have a lot of other visuals, more recently on environmental justice, for example. I invite you to check those out as well. And visuals have the power to provoke thoughts and emotions, and not only inform narratives, but that compel people to take action. And because human beings are highly visual processors, and a portion of our brain is dedicated to processing visual information, we try to use this to make information more accessible for movements. Today, visual storytelling and visual representation of data are not optional in communications. They are actually essential tools, and we see them being used by traditional media, social media, and activism. Before I joined VP, I used VP's visuals quite extensively to inform people about Palestine. And every day we see people downloading our visuals. Just this past week, we've had 8 downloads from 8 countries, from 3 continents: the US, Canada, Belgium, Sweden, Palestine, India, Germany, Denmark. And like we're talking about India, which is a context where narrative has been quite interesting as well with Israel and India's relations over the past few years. And most people don't realize the extensive creative work that goes into creating visuals. With each visual we produce, we're trying to show a lot of information in a simplified way with one image. And it takes a lot of art to actually convey the nuance in the data that we're sharing in the visuals. VP's designers have been talking about expanding visual language available for talking about Palestine. So, we are used to seeing the same images over and over again. We see a lot of the images that are associated with Palestinian nationalism. For example, we see the Palestinian flag being used in a lot of, Palestinian work. If you check out VP's visuals, you won't see the Palestinian flag, actually. And that is basically not because we want, we're rejecting the Palestinian flag. Obviously, we're all very proud of it, but mainly because we want to offer something new. We want to offer a new imagination for people. And, we want them to be engaged in different ways also, and to broaden what's possible in terms of their imagination for Palestine and the future. And then in our visuals, we're really forced to hone in on what is the main message, what is the most important thing for people to understand, and how can we represent that visually. And so, because there isn't an obvious way, there are so many ways to represent things visually. So that's often a challenge, but it's also quite fun to really think about how we want to represent our issues. And then I think I want to just end with this one quote from a member that used visualizing Palestine's visuals, and when she was sharing her imagination for the future, she said, "Right now, visualizing Palestine is a vital tool, but one day when Palestinians are free, these visuals will be a powerful record of what it took to get there." And I think this summarizes really quite well what we're all trying to do as 3 organizations, right? We're all not only changing and driving a different narrative, but we also want to document all of the atrocities that we're experiencing, but also to think about what our future looks like. And a lot of our work contributes to how we can imagine a different future.
Thank you for that. And indeed, all of the organizations that you represent are engaged in this wonderful work. And I also want to, I want to plug Palestine Rights as well, the Literature Festival. We're going to do it again next spring. So we can throw that into the mix of changing narratives. But Amy, I want to move to you now. If Aylan talked a little bit about the ways that Black Lives Matter and you didn't necessarily touch on this, but also the indigenous struggles in the United States have actually advanced the Palestinian narrative. Because we're all connected, of course. And so when one, all boats float, when one moves in a direction, we pull each other and we support each other. I'm curious, if that's also true in Europe and the UK. And also if you can touch on something else that was mentioned is this sort of theft of Palestinian culture. I mean, they haven't just stolen our country and our heritage, but they're stealing our food and our clothes and pretending that it's theirs. And I'm curious if that's also prevalent in the UK and Europe. And if you can just generally kind of talk about what that means to us, this sort of Israeli, this new kind of drive to indigenize themselves. So I'll let you take it over from here. You're also muted, I think.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has had an impact. Certainly, it's had an impact here as well, and in Europe generally, I think. And there's a real sort of connection. I think also probably COVID as well, and just kind of the way that kind of different interconnections happened as a result of all suddenly going online, also had an impact in terms of kind of connecting with different social justice movements more, and really sort of learning from each other in terms of what the pandemic threw up for lots of different kind of marginalized communities around the world as well. I think that sort of played a part too. But in terms of the kind of question around the stealing of culture or appropriation of culture, certainly, you often get so many restaurants here, which are Middle Eastern restaurants, and then, suddenly you realize it's an Israeli restaurant serving Palestinian food. It's just kind of like quite amazing kind of marketing that goes on. But I think more than kind of appropriation, it's just kind of the closing down of spaces for culture or even recognition. I think there's been a huge problem in terms of just having an audience to recognize, for me, my background is in Palestinian literature, and it was a huge thing for me to be able to connect also through reading Palestinian literature in terms of the kind of fragmented community, whether that's Palestinians within Palestine, whether in 48, whether sort of in the diaspora, lots of different experiences, but a community that had created this incredible body of literature, very sophisticated, self-questioning and exciting literature. And I remember once asking somebody who had been working in the humanitarian sector and had been living in Palestine for a number of years, who were the Palestinians he really admired? And he couldn't come up with a single Palestinian. I thought it was quite remarkable that it hadn't occurred to him. He was surrounded by Palestinian food, culture, music, embroidery, poetry, everything. And none of it had registered, because the only way that he looked at Palestinians were as perennial victims that he was there to support in some way, as a humanitarian kind of initiative. And I just want to sort of go back a little bit to the question about self-censorship as well, because I think that this kind of also the NGOization of Palestinian society has also meant that Palestinians have self-censored in terms of kind of what they're able to say in order to kind of navigate funding, also in terms of what might be politically viable. We've internalized what might be operationable and what we might actually be able to achieve. And I think that is beginning to come apart now with these intersectional movements and these conversations. We're sort of learning from other struggles as well that actually that isn't any way that we're going to move forward. We actually have to work in a really different way if we're going to make any progress. And I think literature and culture plays a huge part in that too, because it's a location. And I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it, Susan, particularly in relation to your latest novel, because it really feels like a space that allows for really difficult questions that offend, things people don't want to hear, and it creates a space for that, but it also creates a space for us to really open up difficult discussions amongst ourselves as well, and join with other kind of movements at the same time.
You brought up some really important things, and I especially appreciate the attention on Palestinian society in particular, and how we are, how we see ourselves, the self-censorship, the NGOization. That's a really great way to describe some of the phenomena that's taking place in Palestine. And you've both, two of you have referred to I was actually supposed to talk about my novel in the opening, but I just couldn't do it. It's just too self-promotional. But I'm glad you brought up the James quote, the James Baldwin quote, because it is very illustrative. And he's also, a personal hero of mine. He's a cultural icon, both as a writer and a revolutionary. And he was instrumental in shifting narratives, and self-image within Black communities as well. And I think that's something that we should also, as people who are cultural practitioners and policymakers, to really focus on how Palestinians, how we see ourselves and see our future. I mean, my books, a lot of people talk about my books being important in changing the perception of Palestine and etc. The reality is that I actually never think of Western readers or any other readers, and I mean, I usually only really actually think about the characters. The characters are Palestinians, which means that when I'm writing for these characters, that means I'm writing for Palestinians, and it's and they are my most important audience. They're my most important readership, because we can't ignore ourselves. We can't ignore our children, our own society. We are an ancient society with this brilliant and splendid heritage and history that spans thousands of years, and it's currently being usurped by people literally who have thousands of years of heritage in Europe and other places. So Anna, I want to go to you to kind of expand a little bit and talk about some of the things that Amy touched on regarding this kind of savior complex that we have to deal with from allies. Sorry, I almost fell off the chair. and this is something I've actually written about, there's this kind of binary when it comes to talking about Palestinians. On the right, we are these, irrational, crazy terrorists, anti-Semites, whatever it is. And then on the left, we are these pitiable people who need charity and people lacking in agency, just so if you can talk to that and just touch on some of the the elements of this kind of binary narrative, how we break out of it, and if you have any other thoughts on that topic.
Many thanks, Susan, for bringing this up. I mean, for me, the answer is connected to what you also mentioned earlier, related to our own homework, our own duty as Palestinians that we need to do before we go to these actors outside, be it on our side or against us, because it's really important that we do the homework right before we reach out to these allies or reclaim these allies, be it from developing world or the global south or others, because the world has changed, and we also need to change our tools and our strategies. Of course, we have the moral strength, as you talked about, but also we need to have different strategies, different tactics, different visions in order to regain these powers or these emerging powers. And that's really the starting point to reclaim that starts at home, starts by the Palestinians at their institutions when they rethink their priorities, their programs of action, but also the institutions that govern them and represent them. All of that matters when we discuss that binary, for example, and when we discuss other issues, but it is really key that we take that seriously. And yes, the narrative and the shifts in narrative plays a role in that, how we bring more allies to our line, if you want, or to our side. But for me, as not only as a Palestinian, but as someone who's co-leading Al-Shabaka here, it is really important that we do our exercise, our homework, and the list is long, which again bring us back to the why do we discuss this in the first place? Why we're talking about narrative? Why we're talking about how do they matter? Like, how do the narrative shifts matter in the first place? I mean, they matter, as illustrated in the discussion over the past 40 minutes. They matter in so many ways because they have impacts on different domains. As you said earlier, they impact identity, they impact perceptions, and perceptions really matter, especially for population of these countries that you talked about in that binary. The perception that we create through this narrative matters, because also that perception also matters for the action after that. Action, be it internal in these countries or the way we do it. So it's really important to connect the shift in narrative with these different domains, like be it the perceptions, the actions, the identity, as well as the impact on the present, the past and present and future histories. And all of that contribute to the process of how it impacts the adopted framework for liberation, because that is our ultimate goal, our ultimate objective. We're changing the narrative, we're engaging in all these processes for that goal. And be it the left or the right, what matters is that we really be very clear about the framework that we're adopting for the liberation project. And let me be very clear, I'm not talking here only about politics. And as this discussion clearly illustrated, we're not talking here about the political circles. We're talking about economic circles, cultural circles, and so on. So it is really that holistic understanding that we need to adopt, where we center on issues related to narrative, but while keeping in mind the bigger picture that relates to the framework for the national liberation. And Yeah, so there are many ways where we can see this happening, but first and foremost, we should really have it at home. And that's really important before we go out to all these actors.
Thank you, Ala. I just looked at the time, so I want to try and address some audience questions. Sorry, I was just looking through some of the questions and comments, but there's one here that I want to mention first, and it's something that particularly rubs me the wrong way, but basically it says, I'm confused by the topic of appropriation of Arab culture. I believe over 50% of the Israeli Jewish population has Middle Eastern heritage. Wouldn't chumos and falafel be part of their culture too? Haven't Jews lived in the Middle East for over 2,000 years? So I'd like to just say, yes, of course, Jews have lived all over the Middle East for thousands of years. They have lived in Europe for thousands of years and other parts of the world, wherever they're from. But living in a place, so for example, Jews who live in Mexico can't, or Israelis who live in Mexico, whatever, can't suddenly, make tacos and burritos and they become Israeli. They're still going to be Mexican food. If you are a Yemeni Jew and you are cooking your indigenous food, it's still Yemeni food. It doesn't become Israeli food. So this is, you don't get to steal other people's culture, period. It's not yours, regardless of where you come from, if you are a Jew who became Israeli, but your heritage is Moroccan, the food you brought from your Moroccan ancestors is still Moroccan. It doesn't become Israeli. So if any of you would like to say anything more to that, on that, just raise your hand. Anybody want to expand on that? Speak up. Okay. So there's
very well, Susan. Thank you.
There's a question. Can you talk a bit about new strategies of the Palestinian struggle on the ground in Palestine since the Unity Intifada started? What we've seen in Sheikh Jarrah, Beta, etc. Are there new forms of resistance? Can they be scaled up? Who wants to take this? Anyone?
Maybe I kick off the discussion very, very briefly. I mean, the inspiring model of the Unity Intifada is that it really meant unity in the proper sense of the word, and that was reflected in the narrative. If you read the manifesto that was issued when the Intifada started, which is rightly called the Manifesto of Hope, it is truly a hopeful sign, despite all the misery and all the despair that surrounds us. But that was a very powerful narrative. It was a very powerful vision. It was very different than the status quo and the existing frameworks. I'm not trying to romanticize the idea, but I'm trying to reflect back to the earlier point that I mentioned that relates to the question of leadership that needs an active vision, long-term vision that capitalize on the Palestinians, all the Palestinians. That Unity Intifada was or is an illustration of that. And it was an illustration about how we can rebuild our power and through unity, through talking to each other, acting together, strategizing together, and bringing a very different narrative after all these years of Oslo narrative, if you like. So that's, I think, where that provided an avenue for hope. It is a conversation and an action to be continued. And it is continuing every day as we speak in terms of the resistance of the Palestinian people and the presence and in Palestine, and the continuation to dismantle the structures of apartheid and settler colonialism and occupation. And that's really where, if we want to find sources for hope, that's where we should look at. That's really one avenue. If you think about it in terms of structures, in terms of leadership model, in terms of narrative use, in terms of action utilized, that can teach us so many lessons for us. And that is really the most important thing, for us, by us. And that's really what we need more of that.
Thank you, Ala. I think I would be remiss to not bring up the new reports from Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and Human Rights Watch, and also apparently the Harvard Law School as well, regarding Israeli apartheid and sort of entrenching that narrative in a solid legal foundation. So we now have that. And I want to say, even though these are organizations outside of Palestine, the work, the impetus for these organizations, the thing that propelled them to conduct these studies over at least a decade, came from the sacrifices of Palestinians. So ultimately, everything is from the sacrifices of Palestinians, most of whose names we don't even know, but we should stress that. And I want to go to you, Amy, to talk about that that kind of that legal narrative now emerging. So, and then just so you guys can prepare yourselves, there's a question from the audience: is what are specific elements of the homework you described, and what is the institutional homework that Palestinians institutions have to do? That's from Bob Hurst. So after Amy, I'm going to give you that question, Ayman. So go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really important development in terms of kind of the mainstreaming of apartheid, which until quite recently had been sort of a really taboo term. But as you say, Susan, this is, it's a term that's been used by Palestinians for a very long time, and many people have been working on making it, making the case for apartheid as a sort of legal term that relates to what's happening to Palestinians. But I think also the other kind of aspect of it is, of course, that it isn't the whole story. And certainly kind of the notion of settler colonialism is one that it remains taboo, really. I think that's something that there needs to be a lot further work on in terms of education, but also in terms of us having the courage to continue to call what is settler colonialism, and not to be afraid of the term. And I think, I mean, certainly here in the UK, there are policymakers who acknowledge the special responsibility, as they see it, of Britain's historical role. But this is always, in terms of the mainstream, framed as they need to deliver on the second part of the promise to Palestinians. So this is something that is a very, very strong narrative that we really have to work at, chipping away at that sort of notion that Britain had a right to give away Palestine in the first place. And there's an enormous amount of effort and work going into rejecting still the use of terms of apartheid and settler colonialism, calling them inflammatory, saying that that's inflammatory rather than the practice of apartheid or settler colonialism itself, and dealing with the issues really kind of like heads it really entails decolonizing the way that people think, the way that they write, the way that they speak, not just about Palestine, but about the world at large as well. So I think this is, again, sort of getting back to the question of intersectionality, another way that we really have to hold on to. And the other thing that often happens, or the way that people often talk here in relation to apartheid, they always sort of say, why don't we have a Nelson Mandela? You know, why don't the Palestinians have a Nelson Mandela? And rewrite the history of the apartheid struggle as well. You know, I remember back in the day, even worked on an ANC campaign back in the 1990s when Nelson Mandela was coming to the UK. And Margaret Thatcher, you know, before that, you know, she had said the ANC was a typical terrorist organization, and many here in the UK concluded that, you know, that it was right to turn back on the freedom struggle. And we're facing exactly the same issues today in terms of closing down speech about apartheid and also around situating it as a settler colonial struggle as well. And I'll just very quickly touch on something. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he died, there was an obituary in The Guardian which didn't mention his take on Palestine at all, anything that he had said about it. But not only did it not mention, the comments that tried to put that right underneath the article were then deleted by the editorial team on the basis that it violated the Guardian's community standards to talk about Israeli apartheid. Now, there was a big movement to sort of push back on that, and eventually the Guardian had to put the comments back and also run a piece about Desmond Tutu and Palestine. But essentially, this is a kind of constant struggle that all the time we have to remain vigilant, all the time we have to push back on this closing down, all the time we have to hold on to the terms that we and the support that we have around the world. And it's a tiring struggle, but it's absolutely essential.
Thank you. That's such a good example too. I mean, it's extraordinary to do a kind of eulogy or piece on Desmond Tutu, and then say that something that Desmond Tutu said his whole life, you know, for many years of his life anyway, that to repeat that in the comment section would violate. I mean, that's just, it boggles the mind. You know, he was a champion of Palestine. He was actually one of the first international figures to make the comparison and do so publicly and unapologetically, despite, you know, enormous backlash against him. I want to say something about the Mandela. You know, where's your Mandela? they also, you know, where's your Gandhi? Where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Whatever. And I find that extraordinary also, and I would like others to comment on this after, Aylan, you take your question. But that, you know, what's implicit in that demand is an acknowledgement that we live under apartheid conditions. But rather than comment on those conditions, they're questioning, they're policing the strategies of victims. You know, you're basically critiquing how victims are resisting apartheid. So that's such an incredible kind of accusing question. And again, this kind of savior mentality in any of it. But Aylan, I'm going to go to you as promised. That question from Bob Hurst. Do you want me to repeat it, or do you want to?
Yeah, that would be great, actually.
Okay, let me find it again.
And actually, Susan, while you're finding it, and because I feel like also Ala has a lot to say about this, since he's the one that brought it up, which is, I think, around what homework we need to do as organizations. Mm-hmm. But I did want to, I wanted to just expand a little bit around the tactics that Palestinians have been using. So many tactics of resistance, right? And I think one of the ones that we haven't mentioned is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And just the impact, the effective impact it has had on forcing conversations about Palestine into the mainstream. We're seeing university administrators, companies, academic bodies, and celebrities forced to take a position, and forced to answer to us as Palestinians. And that's very important. I mean, we saw last year Ben and Jerry's ending their presence in illegal settlement. Of course, it was, there has been criticism around that as well, and the extent of the disengagement, but it's a very important move. For example, at Visualizing Palestine, we've actually been documenting these BDS wins over the years on a growth of a movement timeline. And then there's another one that the U.S. Campaign on Palestinian Rights has specifically on U.S. wins. But we can't underestimate those. And one of the issues that we obviously have is the anti-BDS laws that are being passed in the U.S. And we have more than 30 states that have passed anti-BDS laws, and for the most part, actually, according to polls, most Americans don't really know what BDS is, right? So unless you're involved in activism, you don't know what it is, and it's being criminalized, right, by Israel, by the U.S., and this is, I think, a problem that we face as Palestinians over and over again, is that every tactic we use is being criminalized, even those tactics that are completely nonviolent. So I will, and I guess a few words I will say around around elements of homework, and then Ala, I'd really like you to expand on this as well. Is there's this, Israel has forced a situation of fragmentation on us as a people. This is true in Palestine, all over Palestine, in Israel proper, Palestinians who live in 1948 areas, in Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, and in the diaspora. And we've been working diligently to reject this fragmentation. And part of that fragmentation is imposed on us also by the Palestinian Authority, which is a subcontractor of the Israeli government, and which is imposing also repression on Palestinians. So part of our internal work is to continue to reject this fragmentation, to continue to challenge our leadership, which has done us so much disservice over the years. And I think another part really that I don't want to underestimate here, and it might sound very flowery, is the importance of hope. And this is such an important element, and this is why art and culture is also they're such important parts of our existence, because they're part of our resistance, and they're beautiful ways to express our resistance. And I think that this is an important aspect to hold on to, because without hope, we will not be able to imagine a different future. So I'll just stop there. And yeah.
Thank you, Aylan. Thank you for bringing it back to hope. Ala, I'm going to give you the last word to answer that question regarding homework and anything else. Keep it brief. I've just been told, and I didn't realize the time that we're over, so we're going to have to wrap up.
Great. Well, I don't think I can be as articulate as Eileen. She summarized it very well. But if I want to bring very quickly key elements for how do we operationalize a Palestinian-led process of change, we really need to invest in creating a new leadership at all levels: intellectual leadership, political leadership, economic leadership, and so on. Investing in leadership is the investment that will yield the highest levels of return. Second, we really need to nourish a culture of debate. We're missing a culture of debate at all levels. And if we really need to change, then we really need to engage in that process seriously. Thirdly, we need to address all levels of fragmentations, not only the binary between Fatah and Hamas. No, we're talking about different levels of fragmentations that need to be tackled and addressed. And we can do it. It's not we created it, we can do it. Or others created it, but we can do it. And fourthly, we need to bring the people to the center of the political system. We've been marginalized as people for so many, many years. It is really time to bring people to the center of the political system if we really want to engage in processes. And we cannot do that if we don't confront securitization and authoritarianism, again, at home. That's really fundamental to do all of that. And finally, we need the institutional readiness, the institutional framework that represents us in a very legitimate, effective way. And that's our biggest task next to the leadership, is how do we reclaim these institutions. And finally, all of this related to our discussion today, related to the narrative and the narrative shifts and the reclaiming of that narrative, because any process that aims to reclaim that narrative first needs to fundamentally believe that this narrative should be embedded in us, really built in us. It should be absorbed by our representative institutions. It should be reflected in this national liberation program. It should be communicated with the world and enforced on these policy circles. But fundamentally, this policy needs to be with us. We carry it and we move with it.
Thank you, Ala. That was a really good way to close the discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Amy for some closing thoughts. Before I do that, I want to thank everybody for being a part of this excellent discussion, for all of the incredible work that you all do and the wonderful organizations that you represent. Thank you to the audience for engaging. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. Thank you for the comments. And Amy might touch on this, but I want to ask you to please support these organizations. There is a donate button at the bottom. I certainly support them. I'm very proud of them, and I hope you will as well. So Amy, thank you for having me, and thank you all for letting me host this, or moderate rather.
Oh, well, it's been really wonderful to be in discussion with you, Susan. Thank you so much, and lovely also Ala and Aileen. It's one of the great hopes for me, or the thing that keeps me hopeful, is sort of working together as organizations. It really makes a huge difference to have that sort of support network and to be able to draw on each other's work. It makes it just makes it possible to keep on working. So thank you very much. And then thanks also to our audience very much. And yeah, as Susan said, there's a donate button at the bottom if you enjoyed our talk today. So once more, thanks again for joining us. And I hope you'll join another time for our upcoming events. Have a great evening.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.